Now, the other groups rejected by Article 17 are the millennialists. This now leads us into the topic of dispensationalism and premillennialism. For you see, Article 17 of the Augsburg Confession was written explicitly to condemn the Anabaptists, who were post-millennialists. Now, most Lutherans will teach that while Article 17 explicitly condemns post-millennialism, premillennialism is also implied, since Article 17 expressly condemns any Jewish opinion about an earthly kingdom in which the ungodly are suppressed. Article 17 also expressly confesses that when Christ returns, the dead will be raised, and that the believers will go into everlasting life and the unbelievers into everlasting torment. Article 17 teaches that this happens immediately at the return of Christ, and thus there is no possibility for Christ to return to rapture up the believers, bind the devil, and establish a 1,000-year kingdom on earth, and then judge the living and the dead after the 1,000 years is up. However, despite this, many Lutherans for hundreds of years did adopt a dispensationalist worldview, including premillennialism and Christian Zionism. Premillennialism was originally held by a number of early church fathers, and for a few centuries was the majority view, although not the only view. The church historian St. Eusebius of Caesarea, an opponent of premillennialism, taught that this view originated in the 1st century Gnostic heretic Cerinthus. Others believe that this view also originated with St. Papias Hierapolis in the early 2nd century, based on unwritten traditions and strange parables. It is believed that it was due to Papias. It is believed that it is due to Papias that so many church fathers began to adopt this opinion of premillennialism. Church fathers such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and even Ambrose of Milan were premillennialists, and thus many later Lutherans would use this as a defense for their premillennialist views. Yet even though St. Ambrose was a premillennialist, his most famous student, St. Augustine of Hippo, was not. Church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, and St. John Chrysostom were amillennialists, and they strictly condemned the premillennialist view. They believed in a non-literal millennium. Instead, they held that the millennium mentioned in Revelation 20 is symbolic. They believed that this 1,000 years is referring to a long period of time. It's similar to how today a person might say, oh, that'll happen in 1,000,000 years. So in the ancient times, people say, well, that'll happen in 1,000 years. It was meant to refer to a very long time. And the amillennialists generally believed that this 1,000 years simply referred to the time between the ascension of Christ and the second coming of Christ, as was the view of St. Augustine of Hippo. Amillennialism became the official view of the Church Catholic, and in the 300s AD, Pope Damasus I condemned premillennialism as a heresy. Amillennialism is still the official position of the Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, that includes groups like the Coptics, the Anglicans, and most Lutherans. Sadly, over the past 500 years, premillennialism has crept into the Lutheran Church. But premillennialism originally starts to get a rise out of John Calvin and the Reformed. The Anabaptists were postmillennialists, and the Calvinists were premillennialists. Calvin himself doesn't speak much about the topic of millennialism and Christian Zionism. It was instead his successor, Theodore Beza, who became a vocal proponent of premillennialism and Christian Zionism. When Beza translated the Geneva Bible, his footnotes for the book of Romans explicitly taught that the Calvinist view would be that all Jews would be converted to Christianity at the return of Christ. Through Calvinism, these doctrines would later be adopted by the English Puritans and the Lutheran Pietists, who were heavily influenced by the Calvinists. In the 1600s, the Pietist theologian Philip Jacob Spener introduced Pre-Millennialism and Christian Zionism into the Lutheran churches of Germany. His follower Nicholas Zinzendorf would spread this teaching into the Moravian Church, and then John and Charles Wesley would in turn be influenced by Zinzendorf and spread the teaching of millennialism into Methodism. The Lutheran Pietists would embrace premillennialism and claimed that Article 17 was only explicitly condemning the Anabaptist postmillennialists and that it did not condemn premillennialism. However, Johann Gerhard, one of the early Orthodox Lutherans who lived in the early 1600s, strongly opposed premillennialism and believed that the Lutheran confessions condemned it. In his annotations on the Revelation of St. John the Theologian, or just his commentary on the book of Revelation, Gerhard said concerning the 1,000 years in Revelation, from an erroneous exposition of this passage, the error of the chiliast arose. Chiliasm is just another name for millennialism, specifically for premillennialism. Chiliasm coming from the Greek word for thousand chilias, whereas millennialism comes from the Latin word for thousand mille. Now, with all that history aside, let us take a moment to discuss why confessional Lutherans oppose premillennialism. Firstly, the scriptures teach that at the return of Christ, the dead will be raised and the living will be transformed. The believers will go into eternal bliss and the unbelievers will enter into eternal torment. Outside of Revelation 20, there is no mention of a supposed 1,000 years between the return of Christ and the final judgment. The Bible simply says that at the return of Christ, in the twinkling of an eye, the dead will be raised and the living will be transformed. There is no gap between the second coming and the final judgment. Secondly, in Acts 2, at the day of Pentecost, Peter stands up and announces that the events of Pentecost are the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. Peter begins by quoting Joel as saying, "in the last days." Joel's prophecies were about the last days, and Peter confesses that we are now in that time. Therefore, the last days are not something that we are waiting for. Instead, the last days began with the ascension of Christ and they will end with the second coming of Christ. We are currently in the last days. Thirdly, at Pentecost, St. Peter quotes Psalm 110, which speaks of Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father until his enemies are made his footstool. Peter quotes this to teach that Jesus is currently reigning in heaven and that at his return his enemies will be defeated and destroyed. In Revelation 20, the dragon is bound for 1,000 years and then destroyed. King David in the Psalm and Peter in Acts both testify that the enemies of God will be defeated as soon as the Messiah returns. Therefore, if the devil is destroyed at the return of Christ, then logically, the devil's binding must be taking place right now. And if we turn to Colossians 2 verses 14 to 15, we read that at the death of Jesus on the cross, Jesus had disarmed the devil and his forces. The devil is currently bound. The binding of the dragon is now. His destruction will happen immediately at the second coming. Now, some premillennialists will claim that if Satan is currently bound, then how come Peter warns us that Satan is prowling around like a lion, ready to devour us? Satan is a lion, but Satan is a chained lion. He cannot harm us if we stay out of his grip. Satan is the tempter, and he can only devour us if he first tempts us to climb into his cage. And the final reason for why we reject the 1,000-year reign of Christ and his saints on earth is because Jesus himself told us that his kingdom is not of this world. God does not desire to establish some earthly kingdom of saints. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells us that at his return the believing sheep will enter into the everlasting kingdom that his Father has prepared from the foundation of the world. Jesus does not promise that there will be an earthly kingdom. Instead, he explicitly tells us that his kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. His kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. And Jesus does not promise that his saints Jesus does not promise his saints that at the second coming they will enter into a temporal kingdom of 1,000 years. Instead, at the return of Christ, he promises us that we will enter into his eternal kingdom. It is true that the Augsburg Confession explicitly rejects postmillennialism and does not explicitly reject premillennialism. Although, since the confessions reject the idea of an earthly kingdom taking place before the resurrection of the dead, and since the confessions explicitly teach the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment as happening at the same time, one can logically conclude that premillennialism is also condemned. Since Article 17 is explicit that Jesus will return in order to enact the final judgment on the last day, there is no possibility for Christ to return, establish a 1,000-year kingdom, and then wait for the final judgment.